The McKinley administration had been very successful. They had increased America's territorial holdings for the Spanish-American War, and America had seen itself as a superpower. And McKinley, who had promised prosperity and a return to stability, in 1896, 4 years later, had achieved it with economic growth due to the warfare, which brought new territories such as Puerto Rico and the Philippines, and by the annexation of Hawaii. All of this made America a veritable imperial power on the world stage by 1900, and McKinley's re-election was not in doubt. The biggest issue was who would be the next vice president, with McKinley's vice president, Garrett Hobart, having died in 1899. The Republicans selected Teddy Roosevelt, a war hero and former Assistant Secretary of Navy who had resigned this commission to fight in the war, leading the famous cavalry brigade known as the Rough Riders. The party chose Roosevelt due to his heroism during the war, but also to mitigate his growing popularity. They also feared his energy and progressive values, and believed he would be a good contrast to McKinley's conservatism. The ticket won easily. However, shortly thereafter, McKinley was assassinated early in his second term, and their worst nightmare came to fruition as Teddy Roosevelt became the President of the United States. Teddy Roosevelt is the youngest man to ever become president at the brisk young age of 42. With this youth came boundless amounts of energy. Roosevelt was vivacious and assertive, even pushy and demanding at times, wanting always to get his way and believing he was doing what was best for the people. With a kind disposition and a cheery smile, he won over the people's hearts, as they believed firmly and correctly that he fought for them. Roosevelt had a history of fighting, being a cowboy and a boxer. Born in New York in 1858, Roosevelt had grown up sickly, spending most of his time indoors reading. However, and outdoor activities such as boxing, hunting, fighting, and camping all made him a strong, robust young man. Perhaps the most fascinating thing about Teddy Roosevelt, both as a person and as a president, were the massive contradictions he lived by. These contradictions did not ruin him, however, but made him an effective and dynamic leader whom Americans loved and trusted. He was always up for a good fight, having resigned his position in the presidential cabinet to lead the Rough Riders and fight in the Spanish-American War in Cuba. Though he was fearsome, he was also fun-loving and jovial, drinking a gallon of coffee a day just so he could have some fun, usually playing games with his children all around the presidential mansion, turning it upside down, and when it was repainted, he was the first one to start calling at the White House. Despite the whimsy and his bellicose nature, Roosevelt was also an excellent negotiator and a brilliant political mind. In 1905, as president, Roosevelt negotiated the end of the Russo-Japanese War, a violent and tumultuous affair between Russia and Japan that had left many dead. Roosevelt's mitigation led to peace between the two sides and resulted in Roosevelt, just a decade after leading the Rough Riders into battle in Cuba, becoming the first American president to win the Nobel Prize. His foreign policy record was indeed excellent and could be boiled down to one simple mantra: speak softly and carry a big stick. Basically, he advocated to work for peace and to talk with each other, but be ready for warfare at any time. This was put on display when Roosevelt helped lead a revolution that created the nation of Panama, separating it from Colombia so that the Panama Canal could be built to connect trade across the Atlantic and Pacific. But perhaps Roosevelt's greatest success as president was domestically, as he took on single-handedly the robber barons, J.P. Morgan, John D. Rockefeller, Andrew Carnegie, and others, who had monopolized the sale of their goods, creating trust to protect them, had underpaid their workers and created unsafe working conditions, had amassed great wealth for themselves, and who had seemingly for decades controlled the American society and government. Despite all of their power and influence and productivity, Roosevelt was not afraid to take them on. TR Square deal program targeted these monopolies, enforcing antitrust laws, regulating the railroad industry with the Hepburn Act of 1906. And when coal miners struck in 1902, Roosevelt refused to let the country freeze, bringing them together with J.P. Morgan and forcing Morgan to pay them a better wage. Roosevelt did not abandon capitalist principles, but believed that businesses needed to be honest and straightforward and pay decent wages and provide decent conditions for their workers. Roosevelt was a progressive reformer who believed that businesses needed to be honest, workers needed to be paid a decent wage, factories needed to be cleaned, and consumer products needed to be safe. And it was with this attitude that he also regulated the meatpacking industry with the Pure Food and Drug Act of 1906, which cleaned up the meatpacking industry and eventually led to the creation of the FDA. Also in 1906, Roosevelt created the National Park Service. Despite being an avid big game hunter who immediately went on safari after his presidency ended, he was a strong conservationist. Roosevelt believed in preserving the natural beauties of the country so that they could be enjoyed forever and consolidating them into national parks such as Yellowstone and Yosemite. He worked tirelessly with John Muir and others to pursue this and is one of the first presidents to be interested in environmentalism. Roosevelt was not perfect. He had less than progressive views about giving land to Native Americans, believing that they should live on reservations, but as president reformed the Indian Services Bureau. Roosevelt's paradoxes led, maybe surprisingly, to undaunted amounts of success, as his presidency is considered one of the most proactive and successful in American history. By 1908, he was as accomplished and popular as ever, but chose to step aside, keeping a promise to the American people, a promise that he would come to regret as he was back in the political game before too long. Disappointed in his hand-picked successor and former best friend William Howard Taft, Roosevelt formed a third party, the Progressive Boom Moose Party, and ran a hellfire campaign against Taft and the Democrat Woodrow Wilson, even getting shot in the process and refusing medical help until he finished giving his speech. However, the divided Republican votes between Taft and Roosevelt led to the Democrat Wilson winning. Roosevelt returned to New York, where he remained a fixture in Republican politics, especially for the progressive wing of the party, until his death of a heart attack at the age of 60 in 1919.